I want to dive deeper by quitting this process and creating a new component. So I'll create a new component with ngGC and I'll name it user, a user component. So I'll hit enter to let it create a new subfolder here in the app folder, the user folder. And there we got CSS, HTML, TS, and this spec file, this testing file. In this user component HTML file, I want to change this. I want to create a new div here where I have a h1 tag where I say user logged in, and then a paragraph where I say user is, and then some data which we're going to fetch from a service actually. So here I want to output the username. I will have to create this property. Now I'm copying this to basically later on check with ngIf which div to display. Here I will say user not logged in. Well, let's make this a lowercase l here and lowercase I. So user not logged in. And then here, of course, we don't display the user. Instead, we have please log in first. So this is my template code here. In the TypeScript file, I want to also adjust this. Here I want to have a user which has a name field, which is of type string, like this, so that I know this is how a user object looks like. I also want to have a is logged in variable or property here, which is false by default. And with that, I can go back to the component here and basically say display the first one with ngIf if is logged in is true, and the second one, of course, here ngIf displayed if it is not true, so if not logged in. That is my user component. Now, of course, this should be added to the app module. It is done so automatically by the CLI, but check that you have both the import and the addition to declarations here. And then we can go to our app component HTML file and include it here, but I won't even do this because I won't watch this app in the browser. Instead, I will only test it. So I will leave this here, close all these files, and now we want to write some tests for this new created user component here. Actually, we already have a spec file, but this is very, very simple. It includes the test bed and async task, though it doesn't use it. And then it only describes that it should create an instance. And here we try to create a new user instance like this. Well, let's remove this test here. It's not really that helpful. Let's write our own tests instead using the Angular 2 testing environment and not creating some, well, non-Angular 2 tests. So here I first want to declare the module again. So I will set up the before each method here, which takes a callback, ES6 function in this case here, where I simply say testbed, and testbed is really just this main testing object giving us access to all this configure my Angular 2 application for testing utilities. And here I want to call configure testing module. This expects to get a JavaScript object where I add my declarations like in the ng module, which is an array. And here I will set up the user component because that's the component I want to test. Make sure to also have that import up here. Now, important, if you were not using the CLI or any other Webpack based setup, you then need to compile components thereafter. You need to execute compile components to, compile them. Only when using Webpack, this is not needed because Webpack has a different workflow build process where they will do this anyways because of the way you import your external HTML files or CSS files. It will do this whilst bundling or producing your app. In a System.js setup, for example, it won't do this automatically, so you will have to do that since the Angular 2 compiler, which would do this in the browser, won't run here. So with that, we have our compiled components or our setup here. And next, I want to create a test. So we write it and then give it some description of your choice. That's just something for you to read to understand these tests if you see them in the log. So here, we want to check that the app was created. So it should create the app. That is what we're checking. And there we then have a second function, which is a ES6 function here with the arrow. And there I want to create my fixture again, where I use the test bed and then create component and create a user component like that. Now we created this component in the testing environment. So it is like if it were added with a selector in some HTML template and we browsed to this page, then Angular 2 would create it in the background. Now here we're creating it. Now here we're creating it. And with this fixture, I can now get my app from this fixture. And there we typically do this by accessing the debug element, which is the element exposed to us for testing purposes, where I can access my component instance. So this is my application, this running component instance. And I can then say, well, I expect this app to be truthy. We saw that before. This just checks, well, does it kind of exist? Well, if I save this and I now run ng-test, let's see if this works. It will take a couple of seconds to start up. And then we see 4 successful tests down there. So this worked. It's a very simple test though. We only checked if the test or if the application is actually starting up. So thus far we had very simple tests, checking if components are created and so on. Let's spice it up and let's add a service to our user folder, the user service.ts file. In this file here, I will basically export my user service class as you know it. And in this class, I want to have a user object which I can retrieve from my component. So here I'll have my user, and this shall be an object where the name is Max. Just like that. That is all. This is a very simple service. And here my user component and ng in it, I want to say this user equals, well, then I need to inject my service here. So let's inject user service here of type user service as we learned it throughout the course. Add the import up here too. And then I can say this user service user. Note that this is no asynchronous task or anything like this. It happens synchronously, but we do inject something. Of course, for this to work, we need to provide it. And here providing it on this level should be enough. So providers user service like this. With that, the application should work, but how do we make testing work? Well, we want to get the username from the service. So let's create a new test for that. We should use the username from the service because in our component here, we're assigning our user property to the user from the service. So that is what I'm testing here. So again, let's write the logic here. And I will basically copy that into that here so that I also get my app. But now I also somehow want to inject my service. So how do we force it to inject this user service into the component in our testing environment? Well, by creating a user service variable here, where I say fixture, debug element, injector to get access to the Angular 2 injector, get, and now user service, which I also need to add as an import at the top. What this does is it uses the Angular 2 injector, which exists and which is, well, part of this component we now created, and tells it, please get me an instance of this user service. This is how we do it. And as a side note, you can learn more about different ways of injecting this in the document, in this article I will give you at the end of this module. So this is the user service here, and with that user service, I can now say that I expect my user service username to equal the app username. Like that. And if I save this, it will re-execute our tests and we should now see 5 successful tests, but we don't. So we can't read name of undefined. What went wrong here? Well, the following went wrong. We're getting this property from the service because we inject it. We do this in ng init, but we're missing one thing which happens automatically in an app running in the browser, but not here. We need to run change detection to update our properties and so on. After running this, after injecting the service, now we see we get a successful test because now we're trying to access our username property on the component after we updated it. And we needed to update it because it isn't in the same state as at the beginning. We injected a service and got data from there, even though that happened synchronously, but it's still not the same state as in, well, our code here, where it is undefined at the beginning. Well, with that, now it would be interesting to see if our ngIf thing here works correctly. So we want to check if we see the username, if we are logged in, and if we don't see it, if we are not logged in. So for this, time to create some new tests, and we should display the username if the user is logged in, I'd say. So let's execute this code here then. And I can generally copy the code from the last test here. Though now I want to do something different. I also want to compile my code, or my template, so I will get access to the compiled template, I should say. So here I will access my fixture, the debug element, and there the native element, which is my template. And then here I want to check if, well, I expect my compiled template, I expect it to have a paragraph element, of course, and there the text content is expected to, let's say, contain the username. So app username, that should work, but only if we're logged in. So if I run it right now, we see it fails. It can't find it because we have please log in first in our text because we're not logged in. So we have to change this. I actually don't have to access my user service like this anymore. It will still get injected here, but I don't want to access it like I do in the test before. So I don't need to explicitly name it here. I don't need to retrieve it from the injector, I should say. It can be done by Angular 2 automatically. And then here, instead, I want to do something different. I want to access my app and set is logged in to true in this test, so that when I now save it, we now see 6 successful tests. Well, on the other hand, I should see something else than the username if I'm not logged in. So here we shouldn't display the username if user is not logged in. So here I will get rid of my app is logged in overriding. I will still detect the changes, but here I expect my text content to not contain this name, so not to contain. If I save this, it should rerun, and now we should have 7 successful tests, and we do. And this is how we can test a couple of things and see if our app behaves as intended here.